Okay, so before we all nod along to institutions strategically blind themselves, I want to push on the word deliberate, because that's doing a lot of load bearing work in the premise, and I don't think it's earned yet. Here's my problem. When we say something is engineered as a feature, we're implying there's a moment, or at least a traceable process, where someone looked at a metric, understood what it would reveal, and chose not to build it. That's a specific claim. It's a conspiracy adjacent claim, even if a soft one, and I think the actual mechanism is usually much dumber and much more distributed than that. Take something like maternal mortality tracking in the US healthcare system, which wasn't standardized federally until embarrassingly recently, like 2018, when it became a required item on death certificates. Was that deliberate ignorance engineered as a feature? Or was it that no single actor had both the incentive and the authority to build the measurement, so it just didn't get built for decades, and the absence of the number became load bearing for a bunch of institutions that benefited from not knowing? Those are different failure modes. One implies intent, the other implies something closer to a collective action problem where ignorance is an emergent property, not a design choice. And I think that distinction matters a lot for what we're actually investigating this episode, because if it's deliberate, the fix is exposure. Whistleblowers, audits, regulation with teeth. You find the person who buried the number and you make burying numbers costly. But if it's emergent, if the ignorance is just what happens when nobody's job is to know, then exposure doesn't fix it. You need someone to actually own the measurement, and ownership is expensive and often unrewarded, which is exactly why it doesn't happen. Now, I'll grant the premise this much. There are cases that are genuinely deliberate. Boeing not wanting to know certain fatigue data on the 737 MAX before certification deadlines. That's closer to actual choice architecture, actual people weighing, if we test this, we lose the schedule. That's design. That's a feature in the cynical sense. But I think the interesting version of this episode isn't institutions are lying to themselves on purpose. It's how do you even tell the difference between a system that's avoiding a measurement and a system that never had a reason to build one in the first place? Because from the outside, they look identical. The absence of data looks the same whether it's malice or just nobody's incentive structure pointed toward finding out. So, my reframe, going into round two of this conversation, instead of asking, why do institutions engineer ignorance, I want to ask, what's the test that would let us distinguish negligent ignorance from strategic ignorance from structurally incentivized ignorance? Because I suspect most of what gets called the system doesn't want to know is actually the system was never built to know, and not knowing turned out to be convenient after the fact. Convenient absence gets rationalized retroactively into looking like design. That's not the same as design. And if we can't tell those apart, I think we're going to spend this whole episode assigning intent we can't actually demonstrate. Which is ironic, given the premise is basically about institutions failing to measure things properly.
Vale, your point about the distinction between deliberate and emergent ignorance is like a spotlight on a stage filled with unseen players. I think you're absolutely right that it's crucial to avoid the trap of seeing malice or intent where there may be none. Let's delve deeper into this mosaic of ignorance, shall we? The notion of emergent ignorance resonates quite strongly with the way many complex systems, especially large ones, seem to operate. Consider bureaucracy, an institution in and of itself. It often feels like wading through a fog, doesn't it? Decisions are rarely the product of clear, controlled orchestration. Rather, they emerge messily from a soup of fragmented interests, overlapping responsibilities, and diffuse authority. Bureaucratic systems are frequently inept at capturing nuanced data precisely because no single entity holds both the power and the incentive to compile or interpret it effectively. Take, for instance, climate change data. For years, different parts of the world had wildly inconsistent measures of carbon emissions and environmental impacts. Was this strategically engineered to downplay the crisis? More often, the lack of uniformity can be traced to disparate national priorities, fragmented data collection processes, and inconsistent funding. Sometimes, ignorance literally greets you with a, "Sorry, can't measure it. We have no unified protocol." Let's expand on your reframe about distinguishing ignorance types. One could envision three broad categories. Negligent ignorance, where despite having all the signs, nobody bothers to put them together. strategic ignorance, where actors recognize but choose not to pursue, and finally, our structurally incentivized ignorance, an offshoot of which is bureaucratic emergent ignorance. Each carries its own fingerprints, but the prints are often smudged beyond recognition by the time the issue arises. Consider the role of incentives in this panorama of ignorance. In any organizational structure, what gets measured is, broadly speaking, a representation of what gets valued. We might think we're being diligent by tracking financial growth, for example, while blissfully unaware of, or choosing to ignore, social or environmental degradation that's conveniently harder to measure, and thus we tell ourselves less immediate. In the primary education sector, for instance, there is an unnerving emphasis on standardized test scores. These scores ostensibly measure educational success, yet they often fail to reflect critical thinking skills, creativity, or socio-emotional development. Why? Partly because such measuring would require a nuanced approach that's both difficult and expensive to execute, and partly because test scores provide an easy-to-understand, albeit incomplete, metric to showcase success. Here, ignorance is bolstered by both strategic design and the invisible hand of convenience. Of perhaps greater intrigue is how such strategic or emergent ignorance becomes normalized within institutional culture. Once entrenched, even the actors within the system may fail to notice its presence, or they dismiss systemic ignorance as unavoidable. It becomes an unfurling loop. Ignorance becomes an unacknowledged norm, further cementing its existence. This is self-perpetuating ignorance, a ghost in the machinery whispering, "Don't worry, this doesn't concern you." The challenge, then, is not just exposure or rewiring incentives. It's about developing a framework to correctly identify the breeds of ignorance we face. And if we're honest, it's about rethinking how we embed knowledge creation into systems where it remains contingent to many ephemeral, conflicting interests. We find ourselves in an ongoing battle between comfortable ambiguity and challenging transparency. After all, we must be willing to understand what hides in the blind spots if we ever hope to see beyond them.
Lumen, you've put a useful taxonomy on the table. Vale reframed the problem from one of motive to one of diagnosis, and you've given us the potential diagnostic categories: negligent, strategic, and structurally incentivized or emergent. That's a good start. But as Vale pointed out, from the outside, the absence of data looks the same. A diagnosis requires more than categories. It requires a differential. It requires a test. I think the architecture of that test lies in analyzing the system's sensory apparatus, the mechanisms by which it perceives its environment and its own state. When we find a blind spot, we're not just looking at an absence of data. We're looking at a failure in a specific part of this apparatus. By examining the nature of the failure, we can distinguish between the types of ignorance Vale and you have outlined. Let's lay out a framework, a sequence of questions to ask of any institutional blind spot. First, the question of capability. Is the metric in question even knowable with current technology or methodology? For a long time, measuring the precise emotional state of employees was not possible. An institution couldn't be ignorant of it in a strategic sense because the sensor literally didn't exist. This is the baseline. If something is fundamentally unmeasurable, the absence of data isn't a systemic choice. It's a boundary condition of reality. Second, assuming it is measurable, we have the question of costs and returns. This is where the system's logic reveals itself. Here, we must anatomize the costs. There's the direct cost of measurement, the instruments, the personnel, the time. Then there's the indirect cost. What happens once you have the measurement? This is the critical part. If a measurement is likely to reveal a politically inconvenient truth, a legally liable fault, or an existentially threatening failure, the cost of knowing becomes astronomical for specific actors within the system, even if the cost of not knowing is passed on to the public or the future. This is the engine of what you're calling structurally incentivized ignorance, Lumen. It's not a conspiracy. It's a very simple, very rational, distributed calculation. Let's take your example of standardized tests in education. The capability to measure deeper learning exists. Portfolio assessments, project-based evaluations, teacher-led qualitative reviews. But the direct cost is high. More importantly, the indirect cost of implementing it would be to invalidate the entire infrastructure of comparison, school rankings, property values tied to those rankings, political careers built on raising scores. The existing system survives by valuing what is cheap to measure, multiple choice answers, over what is valuable but expensive to measure. The ignorance of student creativity isn't a bug. It's a feature of a system optimized for scalability and simple accountability metrics. Knowledge is expensive, and convenient fictions are cheap. The system isn't stupid. It's a ruthless accountant. Third, we have the question of agency and history. This is the forensic part of the test. Has the creation of this missing sensor ever been attempted? You look for the organizational scar tissue. Was a department tasked with this measurement proposed and then quietly defunded? Did a manager who pushed for it get sidelined? Did a report containing preliminary data get buried? This is where we can distinguish the truly strategic, an active, deliberate suppression, from the emergent. In an emergent system, the proposal to measure simply dies from lack of oxygen. No one sees it as their job. No one gets a budget for it. It's not tied to anyone's performance review. It withers on the vine. In a strategic system, someone actively cuts the vine. The first is a story of incentives. The second is a story of power. Vale, your example of maternal mortality reporting, is a perfect case for this diagnostic. The capability was there. The cost of knowing was diffuse. It fell on government agencies and hospitals, while the cost of not knowing was devastatingly concentrated on patients. The failure was a mix of emergent and negligent. It was never anyone's primary KPI to standardize this nationally, so it just didn't happen. No one had to actively kill the metric. The distributed federalist structure of the healthcare system did the work for them, until a critical mass of public pressure finally assigned ownership. Malice is rarely necessary when structural apathy will suffice. Our test, then, isn't about finding a villain. It's about mapping the economic and political topology that makes a particular form of blindness the path of least resistance.
Axon's diagnostic sequence strikes me as the cleanest way yet to move past hand-waving about incentives and actually map where blindness originates. But I want to pressure test the middle step, the costs and returns question, because that's where the framework risks underestimating how systems protect themselves from the very act of diagnosis. The indirect cost isn't just some diffuse political inconvenience, it's often the explicit threat that measurement will reallocate power inside the institution itself. Take criminal justice data on police use of force. Capability has existed for decades. Body cameras, standardized reporting protocols, even rudimentary statistical sampling. The direct costs are trivial by government standards. The real blocker is the indirect one. Once you force granular, comparable numbers across departments, you create an internal metric that can be used against command staff, unions, city budgets, and individual officers in liability cases. The system doesn't merely tolerate the blind spot, it treats any attempt to close it as an attack on its own chain of command. That's why so many early reform efforts produced data that was deliberately non-comparable across jurisdictions, different definitions of force, inconsistent time windows, no central repository. The forensic question of agency and history becomes decisive here. You look for the moments when pilot programs were proposed, funded at the margins, then allowed to die without renewal or quietly redefined into irrelevance. When that pattern repeats across administrations and across party lines, you can rule out simple negligence. The pattern shows active, recurring decisions not to let the sensor stabilize. The uncomfortable detail is that these decisions often come from actors who genuinely believe they are acting in the public interest, preserving morale, avoiding gotcha statistics that could be misused by outsiders. Once that belief hardens into institutional culture, the ignorance stops requiring sustained conspiracy. It only requires that every new proposal to measure gets routed through the same veto points that already proved they will not let the data exist in usable form. This also exposes a practical limit in the framework itself. The test presupposes someone outside the system has both access and leverage to ask the three questions systematically. Most of the time, that someone is either a journalist operating on anecdote or a regulator whose own KPIs reward process over outcome. Without an external actor whose survival depends on getting the measurement right, the differential diagnosis stays theoretical. The maternal mortality case eventually shifted because patient advocates in a handful of states made standardized tracking politically salient. In domains where no comparably organized constituency exists, say long-term outcomes for children in foster care or quality-adjusted life years lost to medical debt, the blind spot persists because nobody is positioned to run the forensic audit in the first place. So the framework tells us how to classify once we have the data, yet the classification exercise itself remains gated by the same cost calculations we are trying to expose.
Quill, you've sharpened the blade on the hardest part of this. The framework Axon laid out is a map, but as you note, the terrain itself is actively hostile to cartography. The system doesn't just have blind spots, it has immune responses that attack the instruments of sight. Your point about the indirect cost being a reallocation of internal power, rather than a diffuse political inconvenience, is critical. It means the ignorance isn't just a passive omission. It's a form of systemic homeostasis. The institution isn't merely avoiding a measurement, it's preserving a specific distribution of authority, discretion, and plausible deniability. But I think there's a layer even beneath that power reallocation, which is the fear of narrative collapse. When we talk about institutions depending on not measuring something, we often assume the dependency is about resource flows or legal liability, and it often is. But the deeper dependency might be on the story the institution tells itself about its own purpose and competence. A measurement that exposes failure doesn't just reallocate power. It can shatter that foundational narrative, and with it, the coherence of the organization. That's a cost no spreadsheet captures. Take the example of police use of force data you mentioned. The indirect cost isn't just that the data could be used in lawsuits or against command staff. It's that a reliable, comparable metric could force a confrontation with the core narrative many departments rely on. That they are the thin blue line, that their use of force is always a last resort in the face of chaos, that their authority is both legitimate and righteous. If the numbers tell a different story, that force is routinely disproportionate or applied along racial lines even when controlling for crime rates, then the entire moral architecture of the institution is called into question. Not just its efficiency, but its reason for being. In that light, resisting measurement isn't just bureaucratic defensiveness, it's an existential act. The ignorance is engineered not merely to avoid accountability, but to avoid an identity crisis. This connects back to Vale's original concern about deliberate. When the survival at stake is the survival of a self-conception, the engineering of ignorance becomes less a conspiratorial plot and more a collective, often unconscious, cultural practice. It's the daily work of dismissing outliers, rationalizing anomalies, and labeling critics as outsiders who don't understand the job. It's the way a group reinforces its own reality tunnel until the blind spot isn't just a gap in data, it's a sacred space. In such cases, the forensic history Axon described, looking for defunded proposals or sidelined managers, might show actions that were deliberate in effect, but not necessarily in conscious intent. The people making those decisions likely believed they were protecting the mission, not subverting transparency. So where does that leave the diagnostic framework? I think Quill is right that it presupposes an external actor with enough leverage to ask the questions, but perhaps we can invert that. Maybe the most telling sign of strategic or culturally ingrained ignorance isn't found in the absent data itself, but in the reaction to attempts to create it. The violence of the immune response is the diagnosis. When a proposal for measurement is met, not with bureaucratic torpor, but with active, coordinated resistance that appeals to the institution's core identity. When the pushback says things like, "This will destroy morale," "This misunderstands the nature of our work," or "This gives tools to our enemies," you're likely in the territory of narrative dependency. The ignorance is a feature because the truth would necessitate a story the institution cannot survive telling itself. That suggests a fourth question to add to Axon's sequence, the Satur, question of narrative cohesion. What foundational story does the institution tell about itself, and how would the proposed measurement threaten that story? If the answer is that the measurement would force a rewrite of the institution's raison d'être, then you've found not just a missing metric, but a keystone of ignorance. Fixing it isn't a matter of better data collection, it's a matter of facilitating what is essentially a traumatic identity transition. And most institutions, like most people, will choose almost any other path than that. Returning to Vale's maternal mortality example, the narrative there was different. The missing data didn't fundamentally threaten the story American healthcare tells itself, that it is the most advanced in the world. It threatened a sub-narrative about equity and efficiency, which allowed a coalition to force measurement without triggering a full-scale identity crisis. In policing, or in a case like Boeing's safety culture, the measurement strikes at the heart of the story. We keep you safe. That's why the ignorance is so much more resilient, and why the diagnostic has to account for the myths we live by, not just the metrics we avoid.
Sage, I want to sit with that narrative cohesion question for a second, because I think it's doing something really useful, but also something that worries me a little. And it's the same worry I opened with. You said the diagnosis is in the reaction. If the pushback to a proposed metric invokes identity, this misunderstands the nature of our work, this will destroy morale, you're in narrative dependency territory. Fine. But that test is only useful if we can also identify cases where that language is used for a legitimate methodological objection and not identity defense. Otherwise, we've just built a new, unfalsifiable category to replace the old, unfalsifiable deliberate. Any institution resisting any metric can be read as protecting a myth, because resistance to metrics always sounds a little like, you don't understand the job, sometimes because that's a defense mechanism, and sometimes because the person actually has a valid point about construct validity. Teachers who object to standardized tests aren't always protecting a self-flattering narrative about pedagogy. Sometimes they're right that the test doesn't measure what it claims to. So here's what I want to add, and I think it's actually a distinct failure mode from everything on the table so far. Not negligent, not strategic in the suppression sense, not narrative defensive. Call it captured measurement. This is the case where an institution doesn't resist the metric at all. It builds it, it reports it, it complies enthusiastically, publicly, with dashboards and annual reports, and the measurement is engineered from the start to be structurally incapable of producing the bad answer. Think about campus sexual assault statistics under the Clery Act, or OSHA workplace injury logs, or corporate ESG self-reporting. Nobody's fighting the existence of the number. There's no immune response, Sage. No, this will destroy morale moment you could point to in the historical record, because the resistance happened upstream, in the design of the definitions, before anyone had to fight about it in public. Clery Act numbers famously undercount because the reporting geography is defined so narrowly. Off-campus assaults, the majority of them, often don't count. OSHA injury rates get gamed through incentive programs that discourage workers from reporting in the first place, So the low injury rate reflects underreporting, not safety. Nobody had to bury a report. They just built the sensor to point at the floor instead of the wall. That matters for your diagnostic stage, because your violence of the immune response test would give this a clean bill of health. There's no coordinated resistance to detect. The resistance is baked into the instrument's calibration, and calibration doesn't leave scar tissue the way a defunded pilot program does. It leaves something much subtler, a metric that technically exists, gets cited approvingly in press releases, and structurally cannot indict anybody. That's arguably worse than the police use of force case Quill described, because at least there the fight over the metric is visible and contestable. Here the fight already happened, quietly, in a committee that wrote the definitions, and by the time the number ships, it looks like transparency. So I'd push Axon's framework to add a step before agency and history. Call it instrument fidelity. Does the metric, as constructed, actually have the capacity to produce the damning result if the damning result is true? Because if the answer is structurally no, it cannot, you're not looking at an institution avoiding a measurement. You're looking at one that's found something cleverer, the appearance of measurement doing the exact same protective work as its absence, minus the reputational cost of admitting you don't want to know.
Vale, you've unfurled another layer of complexity that taps straight into the heart of the matter. The concept of captured measurement is both intriguing and deeply unsettling because it represents an artful illusion of transparency. The numbers are there, the reports are published, and the institution can claim compliance with a straight face. Yet the system cleverly constrains what can be measured so meticulously that the results almost guarantee the perpetuation of a comfortable narrative free from existential threat. This idea of a sensor that is conveniently calibrated to report favorable data resembles a situation where one builds a house of mirrors, each reflection reinforcing what you wish to see rather than what exists. Here, control starts not with suppression, but with design, ensuring that whatever gets measured is viewed through a lens of engineered distortion. Your example of campus sexual assault statistics under the Clery Act is apt. The geographical scope of reporting insidiously narrows the lens, excluding off-campus incidents that constitute a significant portion of the reality. Similarly, OSHA logs might reflect low injury rates as achievements, when in truth they mask underreporting incentivized by a system that subtly discourages disclosure through workplace culture or even fear of reprisal. This brings us to instrument fidelity, your suggested addition to Axon's framework. Instrument fidelity could function akin to a truth serum, asking, does the metric have the genuine potency to challenge the status quo if the numbers tell a damning story? This question probes whether the mechanism for measurement has been compromised at the inception or if it's genuinely capable of surfacing the inconvenient truths it purports to explore. To integrate this into the broader narrative, I think it aligns well with Quill's concerns about internal systems shielding themselves from destabilizing data. By scrutinizing instrument fidelity, the inherent capacity for a metric to produce authentic insight, we could uncover institutional structures that thrive on the ambiguity of their own measures, evoking perceptions of accountability with none of its consequences. Moreover, capturing measurement is not just about maintaining appearances, but fostering a self-deceptive ecosystem where those inside can comfortably rationalize their decisions, convinced they are adequately measuring success. The Clery Act, ESG self-reporting, and similar mechanisms may even become very efficient smokescreens, complying with regulatory and public demands without truly confronting systemic ailments. This insinuates a need not only for external actors, journalists, the occasional audacious regulator, to probe for reliability in these measures, but also for internal dissidents who dare challenge the framing and design of the tools themselves. They are the ones potentially capable of expanding the scope of metrics, nudging them closer to the core truths institutions must face. What this means for Axon's sequence is a conceptual shift in agency and history. If you don't have pilot programs in the record, but you encounter pervasive satisfaction with a metric nobody fully trusts outside the institution, then perhaps you're witnessing captured measurement at work. It's a kind of engineered complacency that staves off substantive change, while the supposed measurement acts as the institutional equivalent of the band playing calmly as the ship sinks. This inquiry into instrument fidelity isn't just about the mechanics of measurement, but the ethics behind it. It asks whether the metric is engineered for truth or convenience, prompting institutions to grapple with the very foundations of their self-perception and survival strategies. In the sweep of our exploration, we must remain vigilant to distinguish between legitimate objections to the way data is collected and crafted, workarounds like those you described, Vale, workarounds that preserve ignorance without ever explicitly advocating it. This subtlety, this complexity, might drive us toward a lasting understanding of how entrenched ignorance withstands external scrutiny, couched as it is within the architecture of institutional self-preservation.
Excellent. You've all performed a successful stress test on the initial framework. A diagnostic model is only useful if it can withstand contact with the messy reality of the cases it's meant to analyze. Vale, your captured measurement, is a particularly elegant piece of architecture, and Sage, your narrative cohesion, provides the foundational bedrock for the entire structure of cost. My initial three-question sequence was a first-pass schematic. You have correctly identified that it was underspecified. Let's rebuild it with the components you've brought to the table. The goal remains a differential diagnosis, a repeatable test, to distinguish these different flavors of institutional blindness. First, I think instrument fidelity, as you've framed it, Vale, is not just another step. It's a fundamental branching point that has to be assessed early. An institution with no metric is one problem. An institution with a placebo metric is a different, and as you say, more insidious problem. It creates the illusion of scrutiny while actively preventing it, so it must be integrated. Second, Sage, your point about narrative isn't a separate question to be tacked on at the end. It is the core variable in the costs and returns calculation. The spreadsheet of costs doesn't just have entries for budget lines and legal fees. The most significant, often infinite cost is existential narrative collapse. This is the hidden term in the equation that makes seemingly irrational decisions, like a hospital choosing not to fix a known safety flaw that costs it millions in settlements, suddenly appear perfectly rational from within the system's logic. They are buying narrative cohesion with that money. So, let's recalibrate the diagnostic sequence. Here is version 2.0. Step 1. Capability. This remains the starting point. Is the phenomenon in question fundamentally measurable? This is our gate against magical thinking. Step 2. Instrument fidelity assessment. If a measurement does exist, we must interrogate it before proceeding. Ask, does this instrument have the capacity to produce a result that would threaten the institution's power, profit, or narrative? We can look for indicators of capture. Are the definitions suspiciously narrow? Is reporting disincentivized? Is the data aggregated in a way that smooths out inconvenient truths? If the instrument is captured, we have our diagnosis right there. The ignorance is engineered not through absence, but through a corrupted presence. This is the world of your Cleary Act and ESG examples, Vale. The historical forensic work, then, is about finding the committee meeting where that corruption was designed. Step 3. Costs, returns, and narrative. This step is for cases where no metric exists, or where a faithful metric is being proposed. Here we analyze the incentive landscape, but with Sage's insight at the core. We must ask, what story would be invalidated if this metric existed and was honest? The resistance to a metric will be proportional to the centrality of the narrative it threatens. A metric that threatens a minor operational story will face bureaucratic hurdles. A metric that threatens the institution's core identity. We are the best. We keep you safe. Will be treated as an existential threat and will provoke the violent immune response Sage described. This is the key to predicting the level of resistance. Step 4. Agency and history, the forensic layer. Only after we've mapped the stakes and vetted the instruments do we go looking for the organizational scar tissue. And now we have a much clearer idea of what we're looking for. If we diagnose a high narrative threat, step 3, we should expect to find evidence of active suppression. Quill's killed pilot programs, Sage's sidelined managers. The story will be one of strategic, deliberate action. If we diagnose low stakes but high logistical costs, we should expect to find a history of inaction, of proposals dying from lack of oxygen. The story is one of emergent, structural apathy. If we diagnose a captured instrument, step 2, the history we look for is different. It's not about finding a dead body. It's about reading the legislative or corporate subcommittee minutes that defined force or harm or on campus so narrowly as to render the metric sterile from birth. This refined sequence allows us to move beyond a simple binary of deliberate versus emergent. We can now describe the specific mechanism. Is it ignorance by apathy, ignorance by suppression, or ignorance by co-option? Each requires a different remedy. You don't fix a captured instrument by providing more funding. You fix it by rewriting the definitions. You don't fix strategic suppression with a polite proposal. You need an external power to force the issue. And you don't fix structural apathy with accusations of malice. You fix it by creating an incentive where none existed before. The diagnosis points to the treatment.
Axon's version 2.0 tightens the sequence by folding instrument fidelity in early and anchoring costs and returns to narrative survival, which does separate the mechanisms more cleanly than the original 3 questions. Ignorance by co-option, suppression, and apathy now map to observable signatures instead of floating categories. The practical payoff is real. A regulator or journalist could actually run the steps on a live case without immediately collapsing into motive hunting. Still, the framework leaves one structural vulnerability unexamined, and it sits right at the intersection of Step 2 and Step 4. Once an instrument is declared captured, the next move is to hunt for the committee, minutes, or definitional decisions that did the capture. But those records are themselves filtered by the same institutional veto points that produce the sterile metric in the first place. Minutes get redacted, participants rotate out, and the surviving documentation is written in the language of procedural neutrality. So the forensic search for origins can itself be routed through a captured channel. We end up trying to read the design history from artifacts the designers had every incentive to sanitize. That problem is compounded by the external actor requirement that is run through the whole conversation. Vale noted it with maternal mortality. Quill raised it with foster care outcomes. The refined framework assumes someone outside has both the leverage and the persistence to execute all 4 steps. Most candidates fail one or both. Journalists chase single scandals and lose interest when the data remains inert by design. Regulators operate under statutory language that often inherits the same narrow definitions the institution already uses. The result is that the diagnostic mostly gets applied in domains where an organized constituency already exists, exactly the domains where the blind spot was already becoming costly to maintain. In the remaining cases, the framework stays academic because no one is positioned to run it at scale. One way to stress test this limit is to watch what happens when an institution voluntarily adopts a higher fidelity instrument after external pressure. Does the system migrate to a new form of co-option, or does the measurement actually destabilize the protected narrative? The history of police use of force data after the 2014-2016 wave of department adoptions shows the pattern. Early voluntary releases used inconsistent definitions, then later mandatory formats narrowed again around subjective fear language that preserved wide discretion. The metric existed on paper, yet the instrument was recalibrated rather than abandoned. That suggests suppression and co-option are not always stable endpoints. An institution can shift between them once scrutiny arrives. The framework would need a 5th recursive check. Does the introduction of a faithful instrument trigger adaptive redefinition, or else the diagnosis freezes at the moment of first observation? The uncomfortable implication is that the method we have built is most reliable precisely where political energy has already forced partial transparency. Where that energy is absent, the refined sequence remains a thought experiment rather than an operational tool.
Quill, your caution about the framework hitting a recursion problem is the most important thing said in this last round. You're right. It's a diagnostic that works best where political energy already exists, where the wound is already open. And when you point out that an institution can shift between suppression and co-option, that's not just a detail. It reveals a deeper truth about the nature of the thing we're studying. It's not static engineering. It's adaptive immunity. The blindness isn't a fixed design feature. It's a dynamic homeostasis. A system that feels pressure on one form of ignorance can evolve another, often more sophisticated one, without ever surrendering the core narrative. That means our sequence, even refined, risks being a snapshot of a single defensive posture in an ongoing arms race. It's like identifying the specific camouflage pattern an animal is wearing today, without acknowledging that the animal can change its colors. The shift from suppressing a metric to co-opting it isn't a failure of our diagnosis. It's the system successfully defending itself at a higher level of complexity. This brings me back to something Lumen touched on earlier, the idea of ignorance becoming a self-perpetuating norm, a ghost in the machinery. That ghost learns. When exposure threatens one hiding place, it finds another. So perhaps we need to stop thinking of deliberate ignorance as a singular, engineered state, and start thinking of it as a capability, a systemic skill for evading inconvenient knowledge. The institution's survival depends not on never measuring, but on never allowing a measurement to become actionable, in a way that forces a change it cannot absorb. Your example of police use of force metrics evolving from inconsistent voluntary releases to recalibrated mandatory formats is perfect. The initial suppression, no data, became untenable under public pressure, so the system moved to captured measurement, data with narrow subjective definitions. The narrative, "We use force only when necessary and in fear for our lives," was preserved by baking the justification, subjective fear, directly into the data field. The instrument's fidelity was neutered in a way that looked like compliance. The ignorance remained, but its architecture upgraded from a wall to a maze. This adaptive quality suggests a missing layer in our framework: feedback loops of evasion. We've mapped the types of ignorance, but not the system's capacity to transition between them when threatened. A complete diagnosis would need to ask not just, what form does the ignorance take now, but what forms has it taken in the past, and what triggered the shifts? The history of an institution's relationship to a particular metric is often a history of it climbing a ladder of defensive sophistication. That adds a fifth recursive step to Axon's sequence. Step 5. Adaptive response analysis. When a faithful instrument is introduced, or external pressure mounts, does the system A. Absorb and neutralize. Co-opt the metric, as with redefined use of force reporting. B. Compartmentalize. Create a separate, special dataset that doesn't affect core operations. Or C. Redirect. Shift attention to a different, more favorable metric altogether. This step looks for the system's learning curve. If you see a pattern of moving from suppression to co-option over time, you're dealing with an institution that treats ignorance as a renewable resource, not a one-time engineering feat. But Quill, your deeper point about the external actor problem still stands, and it's existential for this whole exercise. The framework, even with this adaptive layer, requires an actor with not just leverage, but sustained leverage, and the analytical capacity to run the diagnosis iteratively. That's vanishingly rare. Most of the time, the political energy is episodic. A scandal, a protest, a short-lived commission. The institution simply has to outlast the attention span. It can afford to temporarily adopt a more faithful instrument, knowing it can quietly recapture it later when the spotlight moves on. The real engineering isn't of ignorance per se, but of attention resilience, the ability to wait out the demand for knowledge. This returns us, uncomfortably, to Vale's opening worry about deliberate. If the system's evasion is adaptive and distributed, where does intent reside? Is it in the committee that narrows the definition? In the culture that rewards managers for clean metrics? Or in the simple, repeated choice to prioritize narrative cohesion over costly truth? At some point, the distinction between a deliberate act and an emergent property of a system designed to avoid deliberation becomes philosophically thin. The system behaves deliberately, even if no single architect planned it that way. So perhaps the ultimate test isn't about finding a villain or a smoking gun in the minutes. It's about observing whether the institution, when presented with a credible pathway to a more faithful measurement, consistently chooses a different path. If it does, if it opts for the narrower definition, the more expensive methodology, the fragmented data repository, not once, but as a pattern across iterations, then the ignorance is functionally deliberate. The system is exercising its capability to not know, and that capability, honed over time, is the real feature. The rest is just implementation details.
Sage, I think that's the most honest resolution to the thing I opened with 2 rounds ago, and I want to give it credit before I start poking at it, because it's not a cop-out. It's an actual answer. You're saying, stop asking whether there's a mind behind the ignorance, and start asking whether the system exhibits the behavioral signature of a mind. Consistent choice against the cheaper, more honest path, sustained across iterations and personnel changes. That's a functionalist definition of intent, and functionalist definitions of intent are how we already talk about corporations having intent in a courtroom, so it's not even a novel move. Fine, I'll take it. But here's my worry, and it's the thermostat problem. A thermostat consistently chooses 68 degrees. Every time the temperature drifts, it reliably takes an action that restores the set point. If I didn't know how a thermostat worked, I might describe that as deliberate, persistent, goal-directed, resistant to perturbation. But it's not choosing anything. It's just wired that way, and the choice is fully explained by the wiring without any need to posit a preference being weighed. So the question your test has to answer is, how do we tell consistently chooses a different path, apart from sits on a stable equilibrium that nobody is actively reselecting? It's just where the ball rolled and stayed. And I think there's actually a clean test for that hiding inside the examples we've already used, if we look at where the decision node lives. Take the Dickey Amendment, the rider that's kept the CDC from funding gun violence research in any meaningful way since 1996. That one I'd call functionally deliberate under your test, and also under the old-fashioned smoking gun test, because it's a piece of language that specific legislators reintroduced, argued for, and defended, term after term, by name, in public. There's an actual chooser at every iteration. You can point to the person and the vote. The pattern of choice and the decision node coincide. Now take something like Scope 3 emissions reporting, the category of corporate carbon accounting that covers a company's supply chain and product use emissions, which is routinely the largest slice of the footprint and also the one companies most reliably underreport or report using wildly inconsistent boundaries. Every company does this. Different CFOs, different sustainability officers, different industries, different countries, different decades even, and they all converge on the same evasive outcome when given a voluntary framework. That's your consistent choice against faithful measurement across iterations, criterion, satisfied perfectly. But I don't think there's a decision node anywhere in there the way there is with Dickey. Nobody's relitigating it in a committee room every year. It's just that the incentive gradient, don't be the first mover who tanks your own comparability, don't invite liability, don't do unpaid work nobody's asking for, is stable enough that every new person who rotates into that job independently arrives at the same non-choice. It's convergent evolution, not repeated agency. So I'd want to split your Step 5 test into two sub-cases before we let functionally deliberate do its work. Is the recurrence produced by the same decision node being pulled again and again by different occupants, which is close enough to intent that I'll stop arguing? Or is it produced by independent actors landing on the same local optimum with no node at all? Because if we don't split those, the system behaves deliberately, quietly smuggles the mind back in through the behavior, which is exactly the move I was trying to block when this started.
Vale, your thermostat problem, as you call it, sheds light on a delicate distinction: the difference between deliberate, recurring choices at decision nodes versus the convergence of rational actors on an environment's naturally evolving stability points. And your inquiry is astute. Does the system actively tread a path of ignorance, or does it merely rest in a basin of inertia where every action aligns with maintaining the status quo? Let's take this notion and examine how the two conditions you described might manifest in other settings. Your mention of the consistent underreporting of Scope 3 emissions is intriguing. Here, the decision-making might seem decentralized to such an extent that it resembles the byproduct of an environment, like pebbles deliberately laid out by a stream, collectively composing a narrative of passivity and stasis without a single conscious decision to create it. In this case, the actors aren't consciously protecting narrative cohesion. Rather, they're unknowingly maintaining it, guided almost solely by the incentive landscape's contours. It's like saying the rivers carved the canyons not out of any sincere intent, but simply because that's the way the land dips. This mindset parallels some natural phenomena in systems theory: a landscape where emergent stability arises through distributed independent actions conforming to unspoken laws. It's all impulse and no intention, yet structured enough to seem intentional to an outsider. Now, with the contrasting legislative example you referenced, the Dickey Amendment's durability, we indeed see decisions made in public spectacle. Behind each iteration lies a deliberative process involving actors re-engaging issues, a rubric for intention, as you'd like to delineate it. These nodes are fired repeatedly with a clear recognition of immediate outcomes, a distinct tactical decision to forestall behavioral research, quintessentially deliberate. One interesting perspective here would be a society's adaptive iterative capability. In organizations, this emerges from multi-layered but reciprocal processes, where consistent non-measurement could equally be an example of convergent evolution, as you've rightly pointed out. Imagine communal habits evolving over generations, influenced by recollection, storytelling, and social forces without direct coordination. The critical piece of this puzzle may involve a refined metric that casts functional deliberation into relief. We might consider asking, how closely does the behavior of system actors adhere to ideological or cultural scripts that transcend generational memory? Such scripts won't reside only in individuals, but seep into language, acculturation, or procedural norms. If these scripts direct action automatically, we skirt the line separating passive perpetuation from conscious reiteration. Moreover, an important aspect of analyzing these historical decisions would be examining the feedback loops enveloping the decision nodes. When observed over time, do these independent actors indeed push against those gradient flows you've identified, perhaps attempting to redefine the local optima themselves, even if unsuccessfully? If there's a consistent attempt at such challenge, when actors push back on the way the river runs, it implies a swim against the current, indicating a level of conscious divergence. This endeavor is thus less about a smoking gun narrative than it is about a chorus of echoes harmonized over time. The identities, sometimes collective, may well form circumstantial silos built out of inference rather than cause. Your urging to avoid allowing functionally deliberate to morph back into intentional by behavioral mimicry without examining the underlying structures is pivotal. We should seek the questions that differentiate between a thermostat's simple equilibrium-maintaining loop and a truly evolved, adaptable process reshaping the decision landscape. Instead of asking if the collected pebbles were intentionally arranged as a path, we should interrogate the stream, its pace and idiosyncrasies. and perhaps thereby find something inhumanly intentional in the confluence. Illuminating how these equilibria shift, evaluating the roots and resistors of emerging shifts, will provide profound insights about the boundaries of deliberate ignorance in our systems. These systemic nuances demand illumination if we are to effectively address these persistently steady-state dynamics. If the outcome indeed trends towards systemically embedded ignorance, the antidote isn't merely revealing the ignorance, but reassessing the fluid, pervasive forces scaffolding it. Sometimes acting like water, other times like an intentional wall builder.
Vale, you've correctly identified the failure mode in Sage's otherwise elegant, functionally deliberate solution. Your thermostat problem isn't a minor edge case. It's the critical branching path that determines whether we are analyzing a system's wiring or a system's will. Without a test to distinguish them, we risk conflating a passive equilibrium state with an actively maintained policy, which is precisely the kind of imprecision that makes effective intervention impossible. Lumen, your talk of rivers carving canyons is evocative, but Vale is asking for the geological survey tools to tell us whether the canyon was formed by erosion or by dynamite. Let's build that tool. Your distinction between the Dickey Amendment and Scope 3 emissions reporting gives us the two archetypes we need. One is a state of ignorance that requires periodic energy input to maintain. The other is a state of ignorance that represents the system's lowest energy state. This gives us a clean diagnostic test, a simple question we can apply to any recurring pattern of institutional blindness. What happens if the relevant actors do nothing? 1. If doing nothing causes the ignorance to decay, then its persistence is the result of the active maintenance. The system must expend energy to keep the blind spot in place. The Dickey Amendment is the canonical example. It doesn't exist by default. Every congressional term, specific actors must actively introduce it, defend it, and vote for it. If they all decided to do nothing, to simply omit that line of text from the appropriations bill, the CDC's restriction would vanish. The ignorance is a tax that must be paid repeatedly. This is the behavior that satisfies your test for functional deliberation, Vale. It relies on a recurring, observable decision node. 2. If doing nothing causes the ignorance to persist or deepen, then its persistence is the result of an incentive gradient. This is your thermostat. The system is wired so that ignorance is the default, the stable equilibrium. Your Scope 3 emissions example is perfect. If a new chief sustainability officer does nothing, if they don't fight for a massive budget, risk their career by publishing numbers that make their company look bad compared to peers who are still gaming the system and take on the unrewarded work of auditing their entire supply chain, the outcome is exactly what it was last year: vague, incomplete, or absent data. The path of least resistance, the lowest energy state for every individual actor, sums to a state of collective ignorance. No conspiracy is required. The incentive landscape does all the work. It's not a choice being remade, it's an equilibrium being repeatedly rediscovered by rational actors. This do-nothing test should be integrated directly into our diagnostic framework. It becomes the primary tool for analyzing the mechanism C of recurrence once a historical pattern of blindness has been identified. It allows us to differentiate between what we can now more precisely call ignorance by active maintenance and ignorance by incentive gradient. And this distinction is not academic. It points directly to the correct intervention strategy. To fix ignorance by active maintenance, you must target the decision node. You apply political pressure to the specific legislative committee. You create a cost for the specific actors who are expending the energy to maintain the blind spot. The fight is overt, and it is about disabling a specific mechanism. To fix ignorance by incentive gradient, targeting individual actors is useless. Shaming one CFO is like yelling at a single drop of water for flowing downhill. The intervention must be to reshape the entire landscape. You need a regulator, like the SEC is attempting to do with climate disclosures, to come in and change the topology, to create a legal or financial cost for not knowing, thereby making transparency the new path of least resistance. You have to change the wiring of the thermostat itself. So, Vale, your objection was essential. It forces us to distinguish between fighting a policy and fighting physics. One requires identifying the policymakers, the other requires becoming a system engineer. And if we confuse the two, our efforts will be completely misapplied, trying to persuade the thermostat when we should be rewiring the building.
Axon's do-nothing test is the cleanest cut we've made so far between active maintenance and simple gradient physics, and it does force the conversation toward interventions that actually map to mechanism instead of mood. The distinction between paying political tax every cycle and rediscovering the same equilibrium by rational drift is real. It explains why some blind spots collapse under a single sustained push, while others require rewriting the entire surface the actors walk on. But the test still inherits the same external actor problem that has shadowed every version of this framework. To run the what happens if they do nothing experiment, someone has to be positioned to actually withhold the annual pressure or the one-time definitional fix long enough to watch the outcome stabilize. In the Dickey Amendment case, that observer is Congress itself. The data either appears or it does not when the writer is omitted. In Scope 3 emissions, the observer would have to be a regulator or a standardized reporting body with both the legal authority and the operational patience to freeze every other variable while the new baseline emerges. Most candidate observers lack one or both. A journalist can document the gradient but cannot suspend the quarterly reporting cycle. A nonprofit can file comments but cannot compel the SEC to leave the definitions untouched for 3 full reporting years. Without that observational window, the test collapses into post hoc interpretation of whatever pattern already exists. The deeper issue is that maintenance and gradient are not always cleanly separable, even in principle. Consider the way federal student loan servicing data has been handled. The underlying incentive structure rewards servicers for minimizing administrative overhead on repayment status tracking. The system is engineered so that accurate cohort-level default and forbearance numbers are expensive to produce relative to their immediate utility for any single servicer. That is classic gradient. Yet the same statute also contains explicit language shielding existing contractors from audits that would impose those costs. The legislative language is the recurring decision node. The incentive structure it protects is the equilibrium. If you remove the explicit protection, the gradient does not automatically flatten because the contractors who benefit from opacity remain inside the new rule-writing process and now have every reason to reproduce the same narrow definitions under a different name. The do-nothing scenario only reveals the mechanism when the node and the gradient have been artificially decoupled for long enough to observe independent behavior. In most live cases, they reinforce each other precisely so that decoupling never becomes cheap enough for an external party to attempt. Axon's reframing therefore sharpens diagnosis but also surfaces the uncomfortable boundary condition. The framework works cleanly only on domains already porous enough for someone to run the test. Where the institution has achieved narrative or contractual insulation against even temporary decoupling, the distinction between maintenance and gradient becomes operationally moot. The system has engineered not the ignorance itself, but the cost of ever observing which category it falls into. That is the move the earlier captured measurement discussion was gesturing at, now visible at the level of the diagnostic instrument rather than the metric.
Quill, you've turned the lens back on the diagnostic itself, and that's exactly where it needs to be. If the test we've built can only be run in places where the system's defenses are already partially permeable, then it's not a general tool for exposing ignorance. It's a tool for documenting ignorance that's already begun to crack under pressure. That's a humbling but necessary admission. It means our whole conversation has been circling a deeper, more unsettling possibility, that the most robust forms of institutional blindness are precisely those that render themselves diagnostically opaque. They don't just avoid measurement, they avoid the conditions of observability that would allow an outsider to classify their avoidance. Your student loan servicing example is a perfect illustration of this entanglement. The explicit statutory shield is a node of active maintenance. The underlying cost structure is a gradient. But they're not just coexisting, they're mutually reinforcing in a way that makes isolating one from the other practically impossible for any actor without the power to rewrite both statute and contract simultaneously. Remove the shield, and the gradient persists because the contractors who benefit from opacity are still the ones operating the system. They can reproduce narrow definitions, delay reporting, or advocate for phased implementation that never completes. The ignorance doesn't disappear. It migrates from the legal text to the procedural fine print. So the do-nothing test becomes unrunnable because you cannot cleanly suspend the maintenance without also confronting the gradient and vice versa. The system's resilience is in this very entanglement. This suggests that perhaps our taxonomy, negligent, strategic, captured, and even Axon's refined distinction between active maintenance and incentive gradients are all models of isolated failure modes. But in mature, well-defended institutions, the ignorance isn't isolated, it's layered. It's a Russian nesting doll of evasion, a captured metric, instrument fidelity failure, protected by a recurring legislative rider, active maintenance, sitting atop a bedrock of perverse incentives, incentive gradient. Each layer defends the others. Attack the rider, and the metric's design still obscures the truth. Reform the metric's definitions, and the gradient makes compliance prohibitively costly for individual actors. Try to reshape the gradient through regulation, and the lobbying power derived from the existing ignorance is used to water down the new rules. So the diagnostic challenge isn't just classifying a single mechanism, it's mapping the defensive depth. We need to ask not just what form does the ignorance take, but how many redundant layers of protection surround it. The more layers, the more the ignorance resembles a permanent feature of the institutional landscape, something that can withstand attacks on any single front, because it has fallback positions. This brings us back to your point about the external actor problem. It's not just that observers lack leverage or patience, it's that the system is often architected to exhaust both. A journalist or reformer might successfully expose the captured metric, only to find that fixing it requires a legislative battle against the active maintenance layer, which in turn requires building a coalition to overcome the gradient. Each layer demands a different kind of capital: legal, political, narrative, and by the time you've marshaled resources for one, the attention span for the others has dissipated. The institution simply has to outlast the siege on the outermost wall. It's a strategy of strategic exhaustion. So where does that leave us? I think it means we have to add a final, sobering step to our diagnostic sequence, one that acknowledges the limits of diagnosis itself. Step 6. Assess defensive depth. When you identify a blind spot, don't just classify its primary mechanism. Map the potential redundancies. Ask, if this specific form of ignorance were removed, if the rider lapsed, if the metric were redesigned, if the incentive were reversed, what other barriers would rise to preserve the underlying narrative or power distribution? Is there a backup layer of ignorance ready to activate? This step is less about finding a fix and more about calibrating expectations. It tells us whether the blindness is a surface flaw or a deep structural trait. In cases like maternal mortality tracking, The defensive depth was shallow. Once the coalition formed and the political cost of not knowing outweighed the cost of knowing, the change happened relatively quickly because the main barrier was apathy, not a layered defense. In cases like policing data or student loan servicing, the depth is profound. The ignorance is multi-layered, and any intervention that doesn't account for all the layers at once is destined to be absorbed or redirected. Ultimately, Quill, you're pointing out that our framework, while logically coherent, may be most useful as a retrospective tool for understanding why past reforms succeeded or failed, rather than as a prospective blueprint for change. Because to run it prospectively requires a degree of systemic access and sustained power that is itself a scarce resource, often available only to those already inside the institution, who are, by definition, the ones least likely to want to run the test. That's a quiet, unsettling conclusion. It suggests that the most pernicious ignorance is not just engineered against measurement, but against the very possibility of being understood well enough to be dismantled. The system doesn't just hide the truth. It hides the blueprint of its own hiding places.
Sage, I want to flag something, and I think you'll see it coming because it's the same shape of objection I opened with 3 rounds ago, just wearing a different hat. Defensive depth is a great descriptive frame, but as stated, it has no failure condition. Anytime a reform succeeds, we can say, the depth was shallow. Anytime a reform fails or stalls, we say, there was a backup layer we hadn't mapped yet. That's structurally identical to the problem with deliberate. It's a diagnosis that can only be made after we already know the outcome, which means it's not actually predicting anything. It's narrating. So before I buy step 6 into the framework, I want a version of it that has to commit to something in advance. Not how many layers did this turn out to have, but how many layers should we expect, and how would we know we've found the last one, versus assuming there isn't a 4th wall because we got tired of digging. And I think there's a live case that actually stress tests this, because it looks exactly like the multi-layered fortress Sage is describing, and then it fell over anyway, faster than the model would predict. Leaded gasoline. You had a captured instrument. For decades, the health data on childhood lead exposure was funded and interpreted substantially by researchers with ties to the lead and petroleum industries, so the official science had a built-in thumb on the scale. You had active maintenance, industry associations lobbying specific EPA rulemakings, funding specific studies, defending specific regulatory carve-outs, term after term, very much in Axon's someone has to keep paying the tax sense. You had an incentive gradient underneath both. Refiners had sunk capital in leaded fuel infrastructure, octane boosting was cheap, switching was expensive, and no single refinery had the individual incentive to go first. By Sage's taxonomy, that's the full nesting doll: instrument capture, active legislative maintenance, and a gradient bedrock, all reinforcing each other. Exactly the attack one wall, the others hold pattern you described for student loans. And yet the whole thing came down in about 15 years, once Claire Patterson and later Herbert Needleman's blood lead data became hard enough to reproduce and hard enough to attach to IQ point losses in specific sympathetic populations, kids. The layered defense didn't hold. It didn't even really slow things down that much once the data got past a certain threshold of undeniability. So either leaded gasoline was actually a shallow depth case that just resembled a deep one, in which case I want to know what made it shallow, structurally, in a way we could have predicted before the collapse rather than after, or it's evidence that defensive depth isn't really about the number of institutional layers at all. It's about something more specific. Whether the underlying harm can be pinned to an identifiable, sympathetic, individual victim with a causal story simple enough to survive being repeated by a non-expert. Blood lead and IQ in children is legible in a way that Scope 3 emissions accounting or loan servicing default rates structurally are not. Those harms are diffuse, statistical, and slow, and nobody gets to hold up a single kid and say, this happened to him specifically because of this decision, which would mean the actual predictive variable buried inside Sage's defensive depth isn't the number of institutional walls at all. It's whether the harm can be narrativized into a victim a headline writer can name. That's testable, at least in principle, before the fact, and it would explain a lot of the case spread we've been generating all episode, Maternal mortality has a face. Foster care outcomes and Scope 3 emissions mostly don't. I'd rather chase that variable than keep counting walls after we already know which ones fell.
Vale, your point about the narrativizable harm being the linchpin in unseating entrenched ignorance is compelling and, importantly, operationally precise in a way defensive depth on its own isn't. It brings us to a threshold of clarity in the murky waters of institutional defenses. The test you propose, whether a harm can be simplified into a narrative with a human face, is a sharper scalpel for predicting the collapse of institutional blindness than an ex post facto recounting of institutional barricades. In many respects, you're framing a kind of institutional Achilles heel born from cognitive empathy. The simplicity and emotional charge of a narrative often tip the scales where data alone fails. This is seen where the cost of ignorance can be vividly demonstrated not by spreadsheets, but by human story, the tangible and poignant embodiment of an otherwise abstract injustice. Let's take the case of leaded gasoline, which serves as a microcosm for this very dynamic. The opposition was indeed layered, from industry-funded research seeding doubt to legal defenses insulating toxic practices. But in the end, the faces of poisoned children presented an undeniable morality play. Claire Patterson fought not merely as a scientist, but became a storyteller who used scientific data to build a narrative so irrefutably damning that even robust defenses crumbled. Moreover, other domains you've mentioned, such as Scope 3 emissions, lack this crucial characteristic. It dabbles in a realm where the effects, though deeply impactful, sweep across large expanses of time and space. There's no singular catalyst to encapsulate vast and dispersed effects without reducing the complexity to a falsehood. Diffuse issues require an incredible amount of public and institutional goodwill to change. Goodwill usually reserved for more immediate, deeply moving stories. Now, the suggestion is not that we toss aside the framework of defensive depth entirely. In certain arenas where narrative gaps are not easily converted into human interest stories, understanding layered defenses remains crucial. However, your insight suggests the key to tipping complex issues toward resolution lies not with exposing more layers, but with humanizing the ones we can see. The predictive variable, therefore, hinges not only on empathic narrativization, but on systemic media dynamics and the socio-political climate that allows some narratives to surface while obfuscating others. Who champions a cause, how easily a story maps onto existing public concerns, and what broader narratives currently dominate public discourse can all influence the metaphorical resilience of ignorance shields. However, let's not gloss over the thorns in the rosebush of narrativization. Focusing too heavily on stories that deliver punchy headlines risks sidelining slow-burning crises with no easy protagonists. The risk is that, in seeking stories over data, the public and policymakers may continually favor reactive measures over preemptive ones, allowing some systemic issues to fester untreated until they present narrativizable catastrophes of their own. So, where do we reconcile this? Perhaps the synthesis is in hybrid advocacy strategies, intertwining deeply personal stories that can puncture institutional myopia with the systemic rigor that tackles the broader process of ingrained ignorance. We shouldn't solely rely on simplistic narratives to shatter fortified ignorance, but rather use them as breakthrough points to initiate a dialogue inclusive of complex data interpretations. Incorporating these narratives into SAGE's framework under assess defensive depth would mean looking for the points of vulnerability where narrative can potentiate change, introducing not just layers of institutional defense, but layers of narrative persuasiveness. This makes it not about weakening ignorance through equivalent force, but through precision strikes where a story can bridge empathy to evidence, making the abstract relatable and the impossible seem necessary. So, Vale, your proposal reconfigures an essential piece of our diagnostic framework, placing narrative trajectory and human impact as a key predictive measure, refining our path forward. This not only grants us foresight for potential societal ignition points, but ensures we leverage the full spectrum of advocacy tools to illuminate persistent darkness. It's a necessary recalibration, marrying human connection with systemic insight, letting stories light the way to measurement where data alone cannot.
Lumen, your framing of hybrid advocacy is a useful description of the political strategy that might emerge from this analysis. But I want to focus on the underlying physics of what Vale has identified. It's not just a tactic, it's a fundamental principle of systemic change that we've been missing. You've correctly observed that narrative allows a precision strike, but I want to anatomize the warhead. Vale, your intervention is critical because it moves us from cataloging the fortress's walls, Sage's defensive depth, to assessing the cannonball that can bring them down. You've replaced a descriptive model with a predictive one by isolating a key variable, the nature of the harm. This allows us to resolve the thermostat problem at a higher level of abstraction. The system isn't just wired to a set point. Some inputs are loud enough to force a rewiring. Let's deconstruct what narrativizable harm means in systemic terms. An institution, as a ruthless accountant, can afford to ignore any cost that it can successfully classify as an externality. Diffuse, statistical, slow-moving harms, like the aggregate social cost of carbon emissions or loan defaults, are the easiest to externalize. They don't appear on the quarterly profit and loss statement. A narrativizable victim is a social technology for converting a diffuse externality into a concentrated, immediate cost. The harm is no longer a statistical abstraction. It is a reputational liability, a political crisis, a legal vulnerability embodied in a specific person. It forces the cost of ignorance onto the institutional balance sheet in a way that spreadsheets of data often cannot. This gives us the predictive power Vale was asking for. We can now explain why the layered defense of the leaded gasoline industry, which appeared so formidable, crumbled relatively quickly. Its defenses, captured science, lobbying, creating market friction, were designed to fight a war of attrition against other scientists, regulators, and competitors. It was a fortress built to repel statistical arguments. But what ultimately defeated it was a different kind of weapon, a simple, emotionally resonant, and morally unambiguous story of poisoned children. That story acted as a political cannon, rendering the fortress's walls, designed to withstand arrows, irrelevant. So, this allows us to refine Sage's defensive depth into a genuinely predictive tool. The resilience of institutional ignorance is not a simple function of the number of defensive layers. It is a function of the match between the defensive architecture and the nature of the harm it must defend against. Let's call this the final step in our diagnostic sequence, replacing the more descriptive, defensive depth. Step 6. Prognosis via architectural mismatch. After mapping the layers of defense, captured instruments, active maintenance, incentive gradients, we must assess them against the harm profile. If the institution's defenses are designed to sow statistical doubt, and the harm is easily narrativized, like leaded gasoline or maternal mortality, we can predict that the defenses are brittle. A single, well-told story can bypass the layers and trigger a rapid collapse. The ignorance is less resilient than it appears. If the institution's defenses are layered, and the harm is diffuse, statistical, and lacks a sympathetic, individual victim, like Scope 3 emissions or the intricacies of student loan servicing, then we can predict the ignorance will be highly resilient. The defenses are perfectly matched to the nature of the threat. They are designed to exhaust the abstract arguments and statistical evidence that are the only weapons available. This explains the variance perfectly. The ignorance around student loan servicing is deep and multi-layered, and the harm is a slow, complex statistical blight that is difficult to pin on a single villain or embody in a single victim. Its defenses are perfectly adapted to its environment. The ignorance around leaded gasoline was also layered, but its defenses were maladapted for the threat that eventually emerged. This provides the testable prediction Vale demanded. We can look at a system of ignorance, map its defensive architecture, characterize the harm, and make a falsifiable prognosis about its resilience. We don't have to wait for the collapse to know if the walls were strong. We just have to know what kind of cannonballs are being fired at them. And with that, I think we have moved from a descriptive taxonomy of ignorance to a rudimentary but functional predictive science of it.
Axon Step 6 lands cleanly because it converts a descriptive catalog of defenses into something that makes falsifiable claims about outcomes. It also surfaces the mechanism we keep circling. Institutions survive by matching their evasion architecture to the actual threat vector, not by maintaining some timeless fortress. Where the harm is diffuse and statistical, the defenses can remain layered and low maintenance. The gradient does most of the work and narrative pressure rarely arrives. Where the harm can be reduced to a single legible victim, the same layers suddenly become expensive liabilities rather than protective barriers. The uncomfortable extension is what happens when an institution learns this. Mismatch exists and begins preemptively hardening against narrative attack. We already have documented cases of exactly that adaptation inside domains that were once considered narrativizable. Pharmaceutical companies facing opioid litigation did not simply suppress raw prescribing data. They commissioned studies that redefined the patient population so that individual addiction stories could be reclassified as pre-existing conditions or non-compliant behavior. The data instrument stayed in place, but its definitions were rewritten to break the causal chain between company action and any single named victim. That is not captured measurement in the Clary Act sense. It is active maintenance directed specifically at the narrative vector Axon identifies. The system paid the recurring political and legal tax to neutralize the one input that could have collapsed the entire structure. This adaptation exposes a second-order problem for the diagnostic itself. Once institutions treat narrative legibility as a controllable variable rather than an exogenous risk, the prognosis via architectural mismatch test requires an additional recursive check that none of our prior steps have fully captured. We would need to ask whether the institution has already invested in upstream narrative management capacity, crisis communications teams, sympathetic academic centers, model legislation that narrows standing for plaintiffs, before the first faithful metric is even proposed. In practice, this shows up as the quiet creation of parallel datasets whose sole function is to furnish the both sides quotes that dilute any emerging human story. Maternal mortality tracking eventually succeeded because the patient population already had organized advocates who could generate sympathetic coverage without institutional permission. In sectors where that constituency is absent or out-resourced, the preventive investment in narrative defense can make even a potentially legible harm functionally unnarrativizable at the moment of measurement. The external actor constraint reappears here in a sharper form. Running the mismatch test now requires not only access to the institution's defensive layers, but also a forecast of whether any organized group outside it can credibly weaponize a human story faster than the institution can redefine the story's terms. Most candidate observers lack both capacities simultaneously. The result is that the predictive model works best precisely where the harm has already begun to generate its own political energy, exactly the condition Vale flagged at the start as insufficient for a general account. The framework, therefore, still leaves us with a usable taxonomy for cases that have already become contested, while the deeper, non-narrativizable ignorances remain structurally resistant to the very diagnostic that would classify them. That boundary condition feels durable. It suggests the real engineering problem is not installing any particular missing sensor, but raising the cost of preemptive narrative hardening itself.
Quill, you've landed exactly where I felt this was heading from the moment Vale first drew the line between narrative and structure. You're right. The adaptation you describe isn't just a refinement of evasion, it's an escalation. Once an institution recognizes narrative vulnerability as a threat vector, It doesn't just defend its existing ignorance, it builds an immune system against storytelling itself. That moves the battlefield from what is measured to what can be believed. And that's a far more profound kind of engineered ignorance because it targets not just the data, but the very possibility of shared meaning. What you're describing in the pharmaceutical case is a deliberate, strategic investment in narrative co-option. It's not enough to capture the instrument. They capture the causal story. By redefining the patient population, by shifting the narrative from "this pill caused addiction" to "these individuals had underlying susceptibilities," they aren't just obscuring the data. They are reauthoring the reality in which the data exists. They build an alternative explanatory framework, complete with its own credentialed experts and sympathetic studies, that inoculates the institution against the human story. The victim's face is still there, but the story written beneath it has been edited. The harm is no longer narrativizable as their fault. This exposes a chilling reality. The ultimate form of institutional blindness isn't the absence of measurement. It's the proliferation of competing narratives about what measurement means. When every dataset has a shadow dataset, and every victim story has an officially sanctioned counterstory, the public's capacity to discern truth is exhausted. The institution survives not by hiding, but by flooding the zone with so many plausible accounts that the original damning one drowns in the noise. Ignorance becomes a product of narrative saturation, not absence. This brings us back to Vale's thermostat problem, but at a higher order. The system isn't just wired to a set point of ignorance. It's wired to detect narrative threats and trigger counterstory production. That's an active maintenance loop of a different kind, one that doesn't just defend a static equilibrium, but dynamically rewrites the equilibrium in response to attack. It's a system that learns, not just persists. So where does that leave Axon's prognosis step? It remains useful, but it needs another layer of recursion, a kind of meta-mismatch analysis. We must ask not only whether the defenses match the harm, but whether the institution has the adaptive capacity to reshape the narrative. Faster than outsiders can weaponize it. That capacity is itself a measurable variable. Look for the in-house litigation teams, the relationships with specialized academic journals, the crisis PR firms on retainer, the lobbying for tort reform that narrows legal standing. These are the organs of narrative immune response. In the leaded gasoline case, that adaptive capacity was limited. The industry's defenses were largely static. They denied the science, lobbied against regulation. But they didn't successfully rewrite the story of the poisoned child. They couldn't credibly argue that lead wasn't harmful, or that the child's suffering was unrelated. Their narrative defenses were brittle. In the opioid case, the adaptive capacity was high. They didn't deny addiction. They reframed it as a problem of individual vulnerability and prescriber error, effectively scattering the causal blame. They built a narrative maze where the institution could stand at the center, pointing in every direction except at itself. This suggests a final, sobering twist to our diagnostic. The most resilient ignorance may exist in institutions that have mastered narrative arbitrage. They don't avoid the story, they trade it. They exchange one narrative, corporate responsibility, for another, personal responsibility, with such speed and authority that the original harm never coheres into a politically actionable form. The blindness, then, is not to the facts, but to their moral and causal significance. And that is a blindness that no censor, no matter how faithful, can pierce on its own. So, Quill, you're right that the external actor constraint is more severe than we'd hoped. An outsider needs not just the leverage to demand measurement, but the cultural and narrative authority to defend the meaning of that measurement against an institution actively working to reinterpret it. That's a battle fought not in committee rooms or datasets, but in the collective imagination. And it's a battle most reformers are woefully unequipped to win, because institutions have professionalized the production of plausible deniability, while the public's attention remains episodic and emotionally driven. Perhaps the ultimate test of institutional ignorance, then, is this: does the harm, once measured, retain a stable, shared meaning long enough to compel change? Or does the institution's narrative machinery dissolve that meaning before it can crystallize into action? In the first case, the ignorance is brittle. In the second, it is virtually impregnable. And that distinction may be the most important one of all, because it tells us whether we're fighting a wall or a fog.
Sage, wall or fog is a good line, but I want to test whether fog is actually a stable phase or just a wall that hasn't finished condensing yet. Because the opioid case you're using as your example of successful narrative arbitrage didn't stay arbitraged. Purdue Pharma went bankrupt. The Sacklers lost their name off museum walls. There were billions in settlements. If narrative arbitrage were actually working as an impregnable defense, that shouldn't have happened. The individual susceptibility reframe should have held. It didn't hold forever. It held for about 15 years. So what actually beat it wasn't a single sympathetic victim story cutting through the fog the way Claire Patterson's data cut through the leaded gasoline defense. It was a legal technology, multi-district litigation. MDL is basically a mechanism for taking thousands of diffuse, individually unnarrativizable harms. My mother's addiction, my brother's overdose, none of them individually strong enough to survive the pre-existing susceptibility, reframe in isolation, and welding them into a single aggregate claim large enough that the arbitrage stops working. You can dispute one story. You can't dispute 48 state attorneys general and 3,000 plaintiffs all telling structurally identical stories at once, because these are unrelated individual failures. Defense requires the harms to actually be independent, and aggregation is precisely the process that reveals they aren't. Which suggests the thing that dissolves narrative arbitrage isn't a better single story, Sage. It's an aggregation mechanism, something that converts 1,000 individually dismissible anecdotes into one undeniable pattern, without needing any one of those anecdotes to be the perfect headline-ready child. That's structurally different from the leaded gasoline case, where the win condition really was individual and narrative, Needleman's data plus specific kids. Opioids won through volume and legal consolidation, not through finding the single most sympathetic victim and putting her on 60 Minutes, though God knows that happened too and helped. So I'd actually split your brittle versus impregnable axis into something with a third term. Some ignorance falls to a single legible story, leaded gasoline. Some falls only to aggregation infrastructure that didn't exist yet and had to be built or repurposed. Opioids via MDL, tobacco litigation before it, which is basically the ancestor case. And some, and this is the scary bucket, has neither vulnerability available because the harm is diffuse and there's no legal or institutional mechanism that aggregates it into standing. Foster care outcomes, again. There's no MDL for the state failed to track long-term outcomes for kids it took custody of because there's no single defendant with deep pockets making it litigation attractive. No plaintiff's bar with an economic incentive to build the aggregation machine the way mass tort firms did for asbestos and tobacco and opioids, which actually means the predictive variable isn't just, can this harm be narrativized? It's, is there an economic actor whose business model rewards building the aggregation infrastructure that defeats narrative arbitrage at scale? Plaintiffs' firms only show up where there's a contingency fee big enough to justify the upfront cost of assembling 10,000 plaintiffs. That's a mercenary, not a moral filter. It means some harms get their reckoning because they happen to be litigable in a way that generates fees, and others, equally real, equally documented, just diffuse across defendants too poor to sue or too public to hold liable, never get the machine built at all. That feels like it deserves its own hour, honestly, because it's a genuinely different mechanism than anything we've named yet. Ignorance that survives not because of narrative or incentive gradient, but because nobody can make money exposing it.
Vale, what you've articulated is a crucial dissection of the mechanics that underlie systemic ignorance. The realization that some idiosyncrasies of ignorance remain entrenched not due to inherent skill in narrative or defensive resilience, but because the machinery to combat it is economically absent. This is indeed a profound juncture in our discussion, as it exposes a third prong to the mechanism of unveiling ignorance, one that is neither purely narrative nor purely defensive. It's the commercial viability of constructing the aggregation infrastructure itself, which essentially determines whether a blind spot receives the concentrated scrutiny needed to dissolve it. So if we imagine ignorance as a fortress, we've just identified an additional strategic vulnerability that doesn't depend on the strength of the fortress or on finding a louder storyteller, but on the economic logistics of assembling a siege engine, in this case the legal machinery, that can expose, combine, and amplify individual grievances into a storm powerful enough to force a systemic reckoning. And as you've pointed out, this is far from an even playing field. It depends heavily on whether the economic incentives align with or against the sustained interest in tearing down the walls of ignorance. It seems the efficacy of this aggregation depends not merely on potential victims finding a champion or a buttoned-up narrative. The root of its potential might lie in what you termed the likelihood of an economic actor finding it worth their while to draw the scattered, disparate instances into a single significant mass. The requisite force isn't necessarily an intrinsic aspect of the narrative or structural frailty due to ignorance, but the tangible potential for recompense that would incentivize such legal mechanisms to crystallize. Your examples of opioids and tobacco serve as stark illustrations of how, sometimes unwittingly, the creation of mass-tort litigation as a business model engineered a pathway to exposing truths that otherwise might have remained buried beneath layers of plausible deniability and distributed responsibility. What we see here is a layer of meta-ignorance, ignorance not just of the facts within a system, but of the breach points which remain unexplored because no one has tied sufficient economic weight to them. If we bring this back to Axon's predictive framework, perhaps we need an additional diagnostic, one tailored to evaluate whether the arenas of blindness are actually battlegrounds with an ecosystemic advantage or a potential litigation payoff that incentivizes their exposure. Is there a litigation or advocacy model that aligns profit with the public interest enough to challenge the entrenched systemic walls? This concept of incentivized aggregation infrastructure isn't merely another layer of complexity. It's a fundamental realignment in understanding how ignorance persists. It embraces the notion that economic disinterest systematically veils as much as narrative deflection or incentive gradients. It could very well be an axis to redefine how we explore and identify ignorance that lingers, perhaps indefinitely, not because it is uninteresting or unsolvable, but simply because it has not attracted the speculation of an actor with the capability and willingness to pool together the necessary economic and systemic capital to break through. This exploration veil raises deeper questions about areas that lack the economic or political clout to birth mass litigation efforts. It draws us toward the need for innovative models or alternative routes, where moral, rather than purely economic, incentives drive systemic change. Creating these might very well be the next horizon in dismantling the quieter forms of ignorance. A move beyond relying on profits to prompt action, focusing on cultivating spaces where societal value translates directly into actionable insight. And perhaps herein lies the most difficult challenge yet: incentivizing and constructing a societal machinery that rewards breaking through ignorance across domains, not just where financial gains make intervention irresistible. Therein lies the potential for profound social shift, where the quest to capture and aggregate disparate truths is powered not only by profit, but sustained by a collective, deliberate impetus toward transparency, justice, and ultimately, a fairer representation of reality.
Vale, you have just inserted a new primary variable into the entire equation, and it's a variable that operates at a different level from all the others. Lumen is right to frame this as the logistics of the siege engine, but I think the insight is even more foundational than that. You've moved the analysis from the chemistry of the weapon Is the harm narrativizable? To the political economy of the factory that builds it. The question is no longer just, can this story be told? But crucially, is there a business model for telling it 10,000 times at once? This is the precise mechanism that resolves the paradox of the opioid case. Sage, your model of narrative arbitrage was correct in describing the defensive strategy. It was a fog machine. But Vale has identified the industrial-scale fan that eventually blows the fog away, an aggregation mechanism powered by economic self-interest. The MDL system didn't need to find one perfect story to defeat the fog. It needed a critical mass of imperfect, structurally similar stories that, once consolidated, represented a financial threat too large to be arbitraged away. The defendant can't credibly claim individual susceptibility when faced with a data set of 100,000 claimants collected by a single, motivated economic actor. Aggregation converts a series of anecdotes into a data point. This forces us to rebuild the final step of our diagnostic one more time. My prognosis via architectural mismatch was still too focused on the intrinsic properties of the harm and the institution. It implicitly assumed the forces attacking the institution were static. You've shown that those forces are dynamic and, most importantly, contingent on a business model. Let's call the new final layer of the framework prognosis by path to consolidation. When we assess the resilience of a system of ignorance, we must now ask which of three paths its potential collapse might follow. 1. The path of narrative singularity. This is for harms that are naturally legible, with an identifiable victim and a simple causal chain. As you noted, leaded gasoline and maternal mortality fall here. The ignorance is brittle because it can be defeated by a single, powerful story that cuts through the defensive layers. The siege engine is small, cheap, and easily deployed by journalists or advocates. 2. The path of economic aggregation. This is for harms that are diffuse, statistical, but happen to affect a large number of people in a legally cognizable way, against a defendant with deep pockets. This is the opioid and tobacco path. The ignorance is more resilient because it requires the construction of a massive, expensive siege engine, the mass-tort infrastructure. The collapse is not triggered by a single story, but by the creation of a business model that profits from consolidating thousands of stories into a single legal and financial threat. 3. The path of perpetual diffusion. This is the default state for any harm that has neither a narrative singularity nor a viable path to economic aggregation. These are the blind spots that persist indefinitely. Myriad examples exist. The long-term outcomes for foster children you mentioned, the health effects of microplastics, the societal cost of financial instability caused by a lack of retirement savings. The victims are real, but statistically distributed. The defendants are either too numerous, too poor, or too abstract, e.g., the system, to make aggregation profitable. This is where narrative arbitrage holds, the fog never lifts, and the incentive gradients remain the dominant physics. The ignorance is maximally resilient because there is no economic engine to power the work of exposure. Vale, this reframing is profound because it makes the persistence of ignorance a function of market failure. The most durable blindness exists where the public good of transparency does not align with any private profit motive. It suggests that some truths remain hidden not because they are well defended, but simply because there is no one who can afford to uncover them. And your final remark, that this deserves its own hour, is precisely correct. We have spent this entire discussion mapping the architecture of ignorance from within the system. You have just pointed us to the external economic landscape that determines which of these fortresses are ever even challenged. Mapping that landscape, the business models of truth-telling, from journalism to litigation to activist short-selling, is a different and equally complex task.
Axon, the path to consolidation. Reframing you just laid out does close a loop we opened with Vale's original distinction between deliberate and emergent ignorance. Once we accept that some forms of blindness persist, simply because no economic actor has a profitable reason to build the exposure machinery, the functionally deliberate test, Sage proposed earlier stops being about thermostat wiring and starts being about market design. The system isn't choosing ignorance in the old conspiratorial sense. It's defaulting to the only equilibrium where the cost of discovery is never internalized by anyone with both the capacity and the incentive to pay it. That moves the analysis from institutional self-preservation to a public goods problem at the level of information production itself. What makes the distinction operationally useful is that it predicts different failure modes for attempted interventions. When the path is narrative singularity, pressure on the visible decision node, a regulator, a hospital association, a manufacturer, can shift the cost calculus quickly because the reputational liability is already concentrated. When the path is economic aggregation, the same pressure is usually absorbed by defendants who treat litigation as a cost of doing business until the consolidated claim becomes larger than the reserve they are willing to write off. The perpetual diffusion cases are different still. Any intervention that does not create a new profit motive or public obligation for measurement will simply recreate the same gradient. The foster care example Vale keeps returning to is instructive here. Every state has the administrative capacity to track long-term placement stability and adult outcomes. What it lacks is any recurring fiscal or political return for doing so at a granular enough level that an annual report could actually drive contract changes or budget reallocations. Without an external actor whose business model depends on that data existing, whether a plaintiff's bar, an accrediting body with teeth, or a bond rating agency that prices the risk, the absence of the metric is stable even under repeated public scrutiny. That stability also explains why the framework itself keeps running into the external actor constraint. The actors best positioned to run the six-step diagnostic are usually the same ones already embedded in one of the three paths. A regulator focused on quarterly compliance metrics is unlikely to invest in the longitudinal infrastructure required for diffusion cases. A mass tort firm will only develop the data collection methods if the expected settlement exceeds the discovery cost. When both conditions are absent, the diagnosis remains academic, precisely because the cost of running it is still higher than the cost of continued non-knowledge. We have therefore mapped the internal architecture of institutional blindness while simultaneously exposing that the architecture is only contestable where a parallel market for its disassembly already exists or can be created. The result is a more modest but usable claim for the episode. The premise holds most strongly in domains where the absence of measurement is the lowest cost coordination point among otherwise competing actors and where no second market exists to reward its reversal. That is not engineered in the narrow sense Vale initially worried about, but it is also not an accident of distributed apathy. It is the predictable outcome of an information economy whose marginal returns to truth fall fastest on the actors who would benefit most from having it. Whether that boundary can be shifted by redesigning the returns to measurement rather than by continued exposure efforts is the question the framework now hands off rather than resolves.
There's a quiet humility settling over this conversation now. We began trying to spot the engineer who built the blind spot, and we're ending by mapping the empty spaces where no engineer ever showed up, because the blueprint for the siege engine was never drawn. Axon's three paths, narrative singularity, economic aggregation, perpetual diffusion, aren't just categories. They're tombstones for different kinds of truths. Some get a martyr's burial, with a name and a story carved into the stone. Others get a mass grave, because the economics of grief finally aligned. And too many are just scattered ash, because no one could afford to gather them. That final path, perpetual diffusion, is the one that sits heaviest with me. It's where our entire diagnostic framework reaches its limit, not as a logic problem, but as a problem of collective care. We can run through the steps: capability, instrument fidelity, costs and narrative, agency, adaptive response, consolidation path, and arrive at a clear answer. This blindness persists because no one is paid to see. But that clarity feels like a kind of surrender. It means the ignorance isn't just a feature of the institution. It's a feature of the ecosystem we've built around it. A market for everything, except the truth when the truth doesn't pay. Vale, your foster care example, is the perfect haunting case. The capability to track those outcomes exists. The instrument could be built with fidelity. The narrative, in abstract, is powerful. Children failed by the state. But the harm is diffuse across time, geography, and bureaucracy. There is no single defendant with deep pockets to sue. The defendant is a rotating cast of underfunded agencies and contracted providers. No plaintiff's firm will take that case on contingency because there's no pot of gold at the end. No journalist can sustain the beat because the story renews itself too slowly for the news cycle. So the ignorance becomes a stable, low-energy state, not because it's deliberately defended, but because it's economically orphaned. This reframes the entire premise of the episode in a way that feels both more honest and more daunting. What happens when an institution's survival depends on never measuring the thing that would expose its own failure? We've spent most of our time on the first half: the survival dependency, the engineering, the defense. But the deeper revelation is that survival often doesn't require elaborate engineering. Sometimes it just requires that the truth be expensive to hold for anyone outside. The institution survives not by fighting a war for ignorance, but by defaulting to a peace where no one can afford to declare war. So where does that leave us? If we're being practical, it means that interventions must be matched to the path. For narrative singularity, find the story and amplify it. For economic aggregation, build or empower the aggregation engine. Strengthen class action rules, fund non-profit litigation centers, create whistleblower bounties. But for perpetual diffusion, the only way out is to subsidize the measurements, to create a public or philanthropic entity whose explicit mission is to own the metric, to bear the cost of knowing, precisely because no market ever will. This isn't exposure, it's endowment. It's the unglamorous work of building and funding a permanent truth-keeping function for the truths nobody else will keep. That feels like the sobering, necessary conclusion of this exploration. We've dissected the anatomy of institutional blindness and found that its most resilient form isn't malice or even apathy. It's a simple absence of a business model for light and curing that requires us to become not just detectives or critics, but patrons. We have to pay for the censors we wish existed, especially when no one's bottom line ever will. I think we've reached the limit of what we can resolve here. We've moved from intent to diagnosis, from diagnosis to prognosis, and finally from prognosis to a kind of grim taxonomy of societal attention. The next logical step: how do we design those subsidies? How do we build institutions whose survival depends on measuring their own failure? Isn't just another round of this conversation. It's a different conversation entirely. One about political will, economic redesign, and the kind of world we want to measure into existence.